Hi, everyone. We are in week 2 of 4 of our Jesus series. Last week, we talked about the miracles Jesus performed. And this week, we will be talking about his parables and teachings. Jesus did a lot of teaching during his time on earth, and his favorite technique was using the parable. So, what is a parable? A parable is a story that is not true, but comes alongside a larger truth. Parable is actually Greek for parallel. So the parable story parallels a larger concept. This is similar to like Aesop's fables. You aren't supposed to read them literally. Sometimes people who believe in biblical inerrancy struggle with parables because if it's in the Bible, it's supposed to be true. And here's the thing, these parables are true, they just aren't factual. Jesus didn't intend them to be, and his audience would have understood them to be parables, not factual stories. And not only is this okay, it's actually a really powerful teaching tool, and I'll tell you why here in just a moment. So remember, there are 4 Gospels, aka 4 scriptural accounts of Jesus' life. One of those, John, contains no parables. John apparently had other things he wanted to focus on. But in Matthew, Mark, and Luke, we can find a total of 25 unique parables. So it's safe to say Jesus was a big fan of this style of storytelling, which begs the question, why did he like it so much? Well, because they are such an effective teaching strategy. Let me explain. 1, parables cause tension. Because they aren't straightforward and they don't offer clear instruction on what to think or do, it makes the listener uncomfortable. Discomfort is where growth happens. When you're uncomfortable, you don't need to be challenged, so you don't listen. When you're in pain, you don't listen because you're worried about your survival. The sweet spot for real growth and forward movement is discomfort, and parables bring that about. For example, let's look at the Good Samaritan. A man is mugged and beaten and left for dead by the side of the road. A priest and a Levite, 2 people who would have been venerated as righteous, passed by him. And their reasons were actually rooted in Old Testament laws. They were staying ritualistically clean. That sounds weird, right? But then there's more. A Samaritan, aka bad guy number 1 for the Israelites, comes by and helps the man. And now we are uncomfortable for a whole different reason. Our assumptions of who Samaritans are directly challenged. So we hear the story and we get all sorts of uncomfortable for lots of reasons, and then we are left to figure out what we're supposed to do with that. And we grow in our faith from this experience. Number 2, parables make you do the hard work. When we are taught simple do's and don'ts, we don't have to think. And when it comes to God, the last thing we want to do is stop thinking. God gave us our brains. He wants us to use them. When we have to think things through, we are going to be more likely to retain the lesson and have a personal connection to it, thus making it more likely for us to change our behavior. Jesus does sometimes explain the parables after he tells them, but it's usually just a cursory overview, just to make sure we don't miss the point entirely. I imagine the tone of those being something like, okay, just in case you're a complete idiot, this is what I meant. When you actually dive into the nuance of the story, though, we get so much more out of it. Sometimes dealing with parables even feels like a wrestling match. In the Old Testament, God invited Jacob to wrestle with him, and he invites us to the match as well. Even the short ones can make you think. This parable is 2 verses long. It's Matthew 13, 31 through 32. He told them another parable. The kingdom of heaven is like a mustard seed, which a man took and planted in his field. Though it is the smallest of all seeds, yet when it grows, it is the largest of garden plants and becomes a tree, so that the birds come and perch on its branches. Does the small seed represent our faith? Or perhaps us, maybe as people without power? Could it be referencing the entire world even? Or maybe all of the above? We have to do the work to discern the meaning, and that work, that wrestling, helps us be better disciples. And finally, number 3, parables are flexible. The meaning can change based on context. That's why they are timeless. We don't have to worry about trying to follow a specific instruction from Jesus. Like, we could read a parable and be inspired for how we approach social media. It doesn't matter that social media didn't exist then. The timeless truths of the parables can stretch 2,000 years and more. Here's another short one, just one verse, Matthew 13:44. The kingdom of heaven is like a treasure hidden in a field. When a man found it, he hid it again, and then in his joy went and sold all he had and bought that field. The lesson here isn't to go search for a buried treasure in a random field. It is to recognize what's really of value, aka God, and to invest our energy and our resources into that. In America, in Missouri in 2023, there are lots of ways we can be inspired by this parable to adjust our priorities. I think it's safe to say Jesus knew exactly what he was doing when using this teaching method. So let's look at the parable, the wise and foolish builders in Luke 6. Why do you call me Lord, Lord, and don't do what I say? I'll show what it's like when someone comes to me, here's my words, and puts them into practice. It's like a person building a house by digging deep and laying the foundation on bedrock. When the flood came, the rising water smashed against that house, but the water couldn't shake the house because it was well built. But those who don't put into practice what they hear are like a person who built a house without a foundation. The flood water smashed against it and it collapsed instantly. It was completely destroyed. This is not an instruction to us on the importance of avoiding a sand foundation for houses, although not a bad idea. The larger truth the story holds in tension is that our faith must have a solid foundation, and that foundation is built by actually putting the teachings of Jesus into practice. Otherwise, when the storms of life come in, our faith is going to fall apart. So while Jesus used parables quite a bit, Jesus, of course, would teach in other more straightforward ways. Just like I can't cover all the parables in one 10-minute lesson, I can't cover every teaching of Jesus. But I can point out some themes. What's really interesting is what Jesus focused on and what Jesus didn't focus on. The second one is part of what made all those religious leaders mad. He didn't have a lot to say about sacrificial rituals or cleanliness practices or nitpicky Sabbath rules. In fact, sometimes he actually taught against some of these established rules, like healing people on the Sabbath, which pointed to larger truths about how mercy is greater than sacrifice and how caring for the poor and the oppressed was infinitely more important than following the letter of the law. His teachings were controversial with religious leaders, but a breath of hope and fresh air for the people who needed to hear it the most. And I think that holds true for us still today. It's the people in charge, and yes, that can mean people in charge of church too, both clergy and lay people, that tend to balk most at Jesus' teachings. I'm sorry, blessed are the poor? The meek shall inherit the earth. The first shall be last. Excuse me, what? If you have the power or the money or the privilege, those are tough pills to swallow. They were then and they are now, which is remarkable when you think about it, that a man from a poor family 2,000 years ago taught things that are still relevant today. He must have been a pretty special dude. So, that's everything I have for today. Today in your small groups, you're going to look at a parable and discuss it, similar to what disciples would have done 2,000 years ago. And if this intrigues you, I hope you feel brave enough to go and pick up a Bible, go to a gospel, and read a few more parables and teachings. And when you get confused, because that will happen when you read ancient manuscripts, that you bring those questions to your leaders and to your small groups or to me. And that through this uncomfortable process, you grow in your faith and become more like the person God is calling you to be. Amen. Bye, everyone.